Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. Today, I am joined by Dr. Daniel Schwemer. Dr. Schwemer is the head of Ancient Near Eastern Studies at Julius Maximilians Universität in Würzburg. He specializes in magic and witchcraft in the ancient Near East and has published extensively on the subject. He serves as epigraphist for the archaeological excavation to the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Bogozköy, Hattuša, which is located in north-central Turkey. And we're primarily going to be talking about the results of that excavation because this year they did actually uncover tablets written in a previously unknown language. So Dr. Schwemer, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Before we get into the interview proper, would you mind telling us how you first became interested in the study of the ancient Near East?
Yeah, I took a very classical way into ancient Eastern studies, which was the normal way historically, actually, because I studied theology. And I was especially interested in Bible study, and in particular in biblical Hebrew. Had learned a bit of biblical Hebrew before starting to study. And then I had the very good fortune to have a professor in biblical Hebrew who said, if you're really interested in that stuff, you must go across the road. There's someone teaching cuneiform. So I went across the road and, well, didn't really come back.
Just stayed over there. My husband did something very similar, actually. He started out as a biblicist and ended up a sumerologist.
It does happen, yeah.
How did you become involved in the excavations at Hattuša?
Yeah, that is part of my studies. When I started here studying in Würzburg, Hittite and Hittite culture and Hittite language was a part of the normal degree program, which is not always the case in ancient Eastern studies, but I sort of grew up with it, studying ancient Eastern studies. And the epigraphist of an excavation is invited by the head of the excavation, by the director, and in this case, this is Andreas Schachner of the German Archaeological Institute, who is the current director of the excavations, who invites a philologist to join the excavation like any other people who are working on this excavation. And his invitation, of course, needs to be approved of by the Turkish authorities, by whose permission and invitation we are all working there. And but there's a historical context to a German scholar being the epigraphist of the Bogozköy excavation, because since the beginning of this excavation in 1905, 1906, the excavations in the Hittite capital have always been a German-Turkish collaboration. And with the finds in Bogozköy Hittitology, the study of Hittite cuneiform tablets really began, and it began in Germany because German scholars were epigraphists of the excavation from the very beginning. And there's a sort of line of generations through German Hittitology. And I'm currently at the end of this line because my own teacher was the epigraphist. Gernot Wilhelm was an epigraphist of the Bogozköy excavation. And I grew into it as a postdoc when I did the first volume of editions of finds from Bogozköy. And when I had become professor in Germany, I seemed to be in the right position to take over when Gernot Wilhelm stopped his work there.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the Hittite Empire, would you mind giving us just a little bit of background of what we're talking about?
Yeah, of course. The Hittite Empire is one of the large Bronze Age early states of the ancient Near East. So mainly in the second millennium, and the most important periods of the Hittite Empire date to the second half of the second millennium, that is in the late Bronze Age. And the center of the Hittite Empire was not on the Nile or on the Euphrates or the Tigris, but a bit on the side of the ancient East in the Anatolian highlands in what is modern central Turkey, east of the Turkey's modern capital, Ankara, in the bend of the Halis River, the bend of the Kızıl Irmak today. And you can see it here on the map. And the Hittites, or what we then get to know as the Hittites in the second millennium, were part of a movement of people in probably the early 3rd millennium, maybe even earlier, of people who spoke an Indo-European language into Anatolia. This is prehistory. We do not fully understand this migration process, but Indo-European languages spread across Anatolia, and Hittite is one of these Anatolian Indo-European languages and is the earliest Indo-European language that is attested so far. And Hittite names for the first time occur in texts from the 20th and 19th century, texts actually not written in Hittite, but written in Assyrian by Assyrian traders who were working and living in Anatolia at the time. And we can see from these texts of Assyrian traders, especially from Kanesh, which you can also see here on the map south of Hattuša, what would later become the Hittite capital. In these texts, we also see that in the later 18th and in the 17th in the later 18th century, the political situation in central Anatolia became very unstable, that there were rivaling small kingdoms, wars, changing alliances. And out of this very unclear and very unstable historical situation grew, as so to say, the winner of all these fights in the 17th century, what we then see as what we call the Hittite Old Kingdom, with a dynasty ruling in the city of Hattuša, where you see the star on the map. And the history of this royal dynasty and their realm, we can then follow through several centuries down to the very end or the very end of the 13th or beginning of the 12th century, when this empire collapses. And the best known phase and historically most important phase of this Hittite kingdom or Hittite empire is the 14th and 13th century BC, when the Hittite kings were part of a, you could say, international system of late Bronze Age states, of kingdoms whose king called themselves great kings and had vassals and ruled over relatively large territories. And these kings called each other brothers, and that was the Hittite king, the pharaoh in Egypt, of the Egypt New Kingdom, the kings of Babylonia and kings of Assyria, for some time also the king of Achyava in the Aegean or in the Greek mainland indeed. And this is an age which is sometimes referred to as the age of the first globalization. And that is, of course, an analogy which is not true to in every detail, but what is true that it is a period of history where we can see that for the first time, the whole world that was known then to the Hittites and the other peoples of that period was interconnected by trade, by war, by diplomacy. And for the first time, it was important when there was a political conflict in Egypt, not only to Egyptians, but also to people in Anatolia, because there were connections, there were interdependencies. And this is documented, of course, in the material culture in these various regions of the ancient East, but an important source for us are the cuneiform texts from Hittite sites, mainly the capital Hattuša, Boğazköy today, but also other provincial towns of the Hittite heartlands, where these cuneiform tablets inscribed in Hittite and also other languages were found, and allow us to reconstruct the history of the ancient East from the perspective of this empire in the very north across the Taurus Mountains, seen from the center of the ancient East, from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, somewhat on the fringe, but very important for that period of history.
Thank you very much. That was very succinct, but also detailed, and I think gives everyone a really good basis for the conversation. When you're working then with these cuneiform
Yeah.
documents that you mentioned, as an epigraphist on an excavation, what are your responsibilities?
Yeah, I'm not the first one who sees the tablet. Usually the first person to see a tablet and to spot it is a workman who's excavating it actually physically. And fortunately in Boğazköy Hattuša, there's a long history of local archaeological practice, families who've for generations worked for this excavation. And I always admire how they recognize these fragments of clay tablets in the clay. So they're usually the first people to see it. Then an archaeologist in the German-Turkish team who is supervising that area of the excavation will record it, make a first recording, take the measurements and bring it into the house at the end of the day. And then I still don't get my hands on it because it goes into conservation, of course, and is first cleaned and secured so that it can be safely handled, because and that is what I think is the great privilege of excavation epigraphy is once we take things out of the ground, they have become exposed. They are vulnerable to all kinds of risks. They can get lost. They can be destroyed. In a way, all these artifacts and tablets are very safe in the ground before we take them out. And later, once they are out of the ground, is our responsibility to make them accessible and do a full documentation. And that is basically my task. If something is found, I have to go there, which I like very much, so that's not a problem. And I have to, the duty of the excavation epigraphist is to do the first full documentation of any cuneiform find, in my case, that is found in Boğazköy Hattuša, and that involves that I take photos of the tablet. Digital photos nowadays are, of course, standard. It involves that I read any fragment that comes out and do a first transliteration, transliterate the cuneiform text into Latin characters, basically. This is what we call the excavation transliteration. And the third thing is that I do, and some epigraphists do it, some don't, I always do a drawing of any fragment and tablet that is found, so that I don't have to write I do also write a description, of course, of the tablet, but I don't have to describe every single wedge. But by my drawing, people later can see what I saw on the original. And the goal is basically that after I leave the excavation, or when the excavation finishes, we're ready for war and earthquake, so to say. If this fragment is lost, then we have a solid record that will allow whatever is on this fragment, whether it's important or not so important, it to be fed into the scientific discourse, into scholarly discourse, and is not lost. And that to me is very important, because in ancient Eastern archaeology and philology, it is unfortunately often the case that we work in certain places for some time, then all of a sudden, and often at an unforeseen time, the site and the artifacts become inaccessible due to all kinds of circumstances, mostly, unfortunately, war and natural disasters. And in Turkey, of course, we hope and think that things are stable and we come back every year, but you never know. And then the final obligation of the epigraphist of an excavation is to make this first documentation accessible to all colleagues by publishing the drawing and publishing the transliteration, at least, and publishing a catalog with also the archaeological data that are associated with any individual fragment, like find spot, etc.
Thank you. So after your official duties as an epigraphist have come to an end, after you've fulfilled all of your obligations, what then happens in the translation life of a cuneiform tablet? Who is responsible for working on it, for producing a good final translation, maybe?
Yes. Yeah, that is different from excavation to excavation. In Boazköy, we have a strategy that is adapted to the particular situation there, that we have a very large number of fragments, in total more than 30,000 now, most of which have been published. But this sounds like a lot, and you think, oh, wonderful, and you have 30,000 complete texts. Unfortunately, that is not the situation, because these clay tablets survive in the Anatolian soil only if they get fire and are hardened by fire. And unfortunately, the Hittites did not fire their clay tablets usually, but they just let them dry in the sun. That was fair enough for them. And when the buildings are destroyed in which the clay tablets are stored, or where they, for whatever reason, are situated, when they are destroyed by fire, they are hardened, they explode and break, but the remains stay in the ground. But any fragment that did not get enough heat perishes and is not visible to us. It's just clay in clay, and we don't see it. And many of the 30,000 cuneiform documents from Boazköy Hattuša are small fragments. And a translation of every single small fragment often doesn't make much sense, because it doesn't tell you much. If I just translate, the king takes ... he ... afterwards ... There are fragments like that, and well, I can translate it, but it doesn't make much sense. But what needs to happen is that the whole community of Hittitologists looks at all these fragments and pieces together the fragments. We call that joins, when individual fragments can be reunited because they belong to one tablet. And even more importantly, the same text is identified, and then you have duplicates. And then from many fragments, you can reconstruct a text like the myth of Telepinu or the annals of Mursili, or I don't know, oracle questions, or whatever it might be. But that is sometimes my task. But with most fragments, this is something that happens in the scholarly community after I've let go of the fragments. So I actually try to publish the 30 odd fragments that we find every year, ideally every year, so that they are fed into the system. And those people who are specialists for the individual groups of texts, because many of the texts that we find I'm not a specialist for, that there are people writing a PhD thesis on a specific ritual, and they know much more about this ritual than I do. So it's better that I publish the new fragment of this ritual, and they can make it part of their study, which then contains a full translation and commentary. And then other people use these texts to write even broader books, overviews, handbooks, etc. So it's a multi-stage process, and the excavation epigraphy is at the very beginning and is still very atomistic and basic, because very rarely we find a full tablet with the whole text. Then, of course, I would like to translate it immediately, but that is not the normal situation, actually.
You mentioned a few of them already, but what genres do you see coming out of Hattuša?
Yeah, well, how do I speak about it? Well, in an interview, there are, just to illustrate, we have about 30,000 fragments from Hattuša. With other find spots, we have about 35,000 fragments, and Hittitologists have sorted them all into text groups, and these text groups are part of a catalog. And this catalog has more than 800 numbers of individual text groups. So it doesn't make much sense to
Let's not go through all of them.
catalog to you, but I try to rather give you a broad outline of what we have. And I think before we talk about individual groups, it's important to bear in mind, because that's different in Hittite Anatolia from other parts of the ancient Near East, that writing culture, the writing of texts cuneiform culture was, according to what we know now, but I think it's not just due to chance, was a practice that was located at the royal court and was done by professionals in the service of the kings. And all the texts that we so far know from the Hittite capital, Hattuša, or any of the provincial towns, are associated with what, in one way or another, with the Hittite state administration in the largest sense. So what we don't have, something that is well known from other areas of the ancient East, are private archives, family archives. Nothing like that has so far been found. So what we're talking about is the written record, or the remains of the written record, of Hittite state administration from, let's say, the 16th century down to the end of the 13th century, with the bulk of the text coming from the 15th to the 13th century. And I think we could define 4 major areas of texts that we have. One you could call political historical. These are texts that were in a very direct way written for the king and his officials. The royal annals, which describe the Hittite military campaigns and other enterprises of the Hittite king. Also, political historical are treaties of the king with his vassal kings, or with equally ranking other kings. The most famous one text of these is the peace treaty between Ramesses II and Hattusili III, and that belongs also into this area. Then, of course, we have letters of the diplomatic correspondence. We have royal decrees. All these texts, and that there are more different kinds of texts, belong to this political historical sphere, which is a large area of cuneiform texts. The second one I would call administrative. These are texts that are really are not so much concerned with ideology and history, but with the day-to-day business of the Hittite state. So we have texts that deal with the wealth of the Hittite king, the lists, what is in the treasure houses of the Hittite king. We have instructions and loyalty oaths for certain groups of officers. We have legal texts, and all this is directly related to how this state is run, how society is run. What we interestingly do not have, which we have in the thousands from Mesopotamia, are texts that deal with the administration of agriculture. There are only very, very few texts. Apparently, this is a whole section of Hittite society that was dealt with without writing. They didn't have to record how much grain they had every year. They administrated that in a different way, and that's very different from what we usually find in Mesopotamia. So political, historical, administrative, and then of course there's an area of scholarship, because Hittite scribes, most of them had a certain task and wrote texts, well, for a certain purpose, but they used cuneiform, and they were educated, and they were interested in cuneiform education also beyond their day-to-day use of the writing system. So they were aware that cuneiform was not a Hittite invention, but came from Mesopotamia, and they imported texts from Mesopotamia, texts that had to do with cuneiform learning, word lists, also Akkadian literary texts, Gilgamesh epic, and texts like that. They were interested in that and made that part of their writing culture, as they did with other narrative texts that belong to their own traditions. And so we have a kind of belles lettres scholarship area. And now, the fourth main area, and that is probably the largest, is religious practice. Because religion was state business, the king was the highest priest, and so the scribes had to organize various aspects of religious life and document it and make it ready for the king's use. And there are, in this group of religious practice, there are, of course, ritual instructional texts that give instructions how to perform the temple cult. We call these texts festival texts because many of them are concerned with certain festivals in the temples that had to be celebrated throughout the year. There are also other rituals that were performed to heal people, therapeutic rituals, rituals against demons, things like that. So this is a very large area that is subdivided in different groups, ritual instructional texts. Then an important group are divinatory texts, oracle recordings of oracle investigations of what to do, where to go on campaign, when to celebrate which festival. All this had to be confirmed with the gods, what they thought was right or what the reason of a certain problem was. And so you could ask the gods questions, but there's also another genre of Hittite texts that develops into a very literary genre. These are the royal prayers. And for the kings, lengthy prayers were composed, which are an important source of information for not only religious attitudes, but actually also political history, because they deal with events that the king, problems and events that the king had to face. And also in religious practice, there are texts that are more of an administrative nature. So inventories of temple, which statue is broken, how many priests are still there, is the temple totally abandoned, what can we do about that? That is also part of that. So I think these are the four main areas: the political historical texts, the administrative texts, the texts that are part of scholarship, and then this vast area that is somehow connected to the religious practice in the Hittite kingdom.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Now, as I said at the beginning of the interview, there was recently a text discovered that is in a previously unknown language.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with such fragmentary material, how difficult is it when you're taking that first look at a tablet fragment to recognize whether this is a new language, it's written in Hittite or something that you're already familiar with?
It very much depends on the size of the fragment. So there's actually a whole group of texts in our catalog that says unknown language, or we don't really know. And most of them are really small fragments, and probably they are in a language that we know well, but there are just 3 signs preserved, and somehow we cannot string them into something that makes sense to us. So with small fragments, there is sometimes a problem, though mostly you see pretty much immediately whether it's Hittite or Pellaec or Luwian or Akkadian for that matter, or Hattic. But with small fragments, there's a problem. And with this tablet that we found this year, it was actually very easy to see because it's the bottom half of a rather biggish tablet. And it begins in Hittite and is perfectly understandable. And then comes a ruling, and then you can read on. It's the same script, of course, and it's relatively easy to read. The reading is not the problem, but I didn't understand a single word, and I didn't recognize. Well, that can also be the case in Hattic or Sumerian, that I don't understand a single word. But it was recognizable that there are none of the word patterns, endings that are known from any of the languages that we know well. And that I could already see on a little photo that Andreas Schachner, the director of the excavations, sent me on WhatsApp. He thought this is an interesting tablet because it was big and it sort of stood out to him, and he said, "You must look at this. We found this morning. Have a look." And I got this little photo, and I began to read and thought, "Oh no, it's another ritual text." Just Hittite. Wrote to him immediately back, "Well, unfortunately, it's nothing special." And then I read on, and 5 minutes later I wrote back, "Well, Andreas, maybe you're right. Maybe it is something special because I don't understand anything from line, whatever it was, onwards." So in that case, it was easy to recognize because it is written in the same script that is typical, the form of cuneiform that Hittite scribes used in the 13th century. So, and it's written phonetically, i.e. in signs that you read as not as logograms, but as phonograms. So there's no problem reading it. But yeah, there were problems and are still problems understanding it. Yeah. And then what also gave it away is that there's a little note before the text starts in Hittite. She or he recites as follows in the language of Kalashma or Kalasma, as you can say Kalashma or Kalasma, it doesn't matter. So that already gave away that something different follows. And yeah, so in this case, it was easy, but it can be difficult if you have only small fragments. Yeah.
Does the Hittite preface give any clue as to what this tablet is recording?
Yeah, it does. Unfortunately, it's only the bottom half. So I still hope that we find the top half of the tablet next year, so that we get the full Hittite introduction to this non-Hittite recitation text that we have on the tablet. And this Hittite introduction, that is clear, is a ritual instruction. So it belongs to this area of religious practice. And it gives instructions for sacrifices and libations. Sheep and oxen have to be slaughtered. Wine, if I remember correctly, is libated. And a deity is addressed. And unfortunately, the text says only deity, and it doesn't give us the name of the deity. So the only information on the location where this is happening is this mention of the city of Kalashma, which we knew from other texts, from historical texts and so on. This city is mentioned, but in the context of a ritual text like this, we also knew it from religious texts, but in that context, this text doesn't have an immediate duplicate as far as we know. And so we know it is a ritual text. We do not really know whether it is more in the area of the temple cult or a therapeutic ritual, because the first few sentences are still missing. I'm sure they would say what the main purpose was, but we can be certain that the foreign language text, the text in the new language, is a recitation addressed to that deity that is mentioned, that also receives the offerings, and that the offering of the sacrifices and libations is the ritual context of the recitation of this text. And we know that the text is complete because at the end of the text it says finished in Hittite. So that is at least certain. So it is certainly a short invocation. I don't know, it's 15 lines or so, 15, 16 lines to a deity who is receiving offerings.
Is it typical for the Hittites to have recorded the religious practices of other cultures and other people groups?
Yeah, in a way it actually is. From Hittite sides, we have texts in Hattic, we have texts in Hurrian, we have texts in Palaic, we have texts in Luwian, we have texts in Akkadian. And many of these texts, and actually for Hattic, Palaic, and Luwian, they are only found in this context. Hurrian and Akkadian are also found in other contexts, but most of these texts belong to ritual practice, and the text parts that are non-Hittite are recitation texts or songs, and they reflect on the one hand religious traditions in the Hittite heartland that are not Hittite but were there before the arrival of the Hittite. This is the Hattic tradition, and Hattic, that's not due to chance that Hattic has this Hatti name to it. It's the original, or not the original, but the pre-Hittite language spoken in central Anatolia, and many of the Hattic religious traditions were taken over by the Hittites, deities, stories, and also recitations. And to the end of the Hittite Empire, you would address a deity, a Hattic deity, preferably in Hattic, or sing songs in Hattic in the cult. So that is a bit like Latin and Greek in the Christian churches, where foreign languages survive from older layers of the religion because they become a sacral language. That is one of the explanations for it. The other is, I think, due to how Hittites conceived of deities, and they conceived of them as human-like, anthropomorphic, and it's maybe not extremely, but it is certainly a polytheistic pantheon with an unlimited number of deities in principle. And because of the anthropomorphic conception of deities, there's this idea that a deity should receive a cult that is appropriate for it. Like you would serve a guest from China, maybe you would serve him Chinese food or try to make him feel at home in foreign lands. That is why what the Hittites did not do is conquer certain areas and then impose the cult of Hattuša in all these places, but rather they thought, well, these deities exist. Of course, there are foreign people in foreign lands, so there are also foreign deities in foreign lands. So they were a reality, and rather than driving them away and imposing their own deities, so to say, all these deities from the various regions of the area that became part of the Hittite Empire then also became, to some extent, part of the Hittite state cult, and the rituals were recorded by Hittite scribes, and to some extent the Hittite king would also visit local temples at certain times for certain festivals, and so we do not only have a linguistic depth historically that ancient traditions survive that are non-Hittite, but also geographically, that various traditions of Anatolia are integrated into this very adaptive state cult of the Hittite kings. And once they are in touch with the state administration, they become part of the written tradition. Of course, there was much more that we don't have in writing. And the final factor is also that and maybe the Hittites were not special in that, but they thought that, certainly at the royal court, that some foreign traditions were very precious, valuable to them, that certain things were well known in Egypt or Babylonia, and it was worthwhile, like you got doctors or artists from foreign courts and employed them. In the same way, you could also make foreign rituals and religious texts part of your own tradition and collect them so that they become part of the written record in the Hittite capital. So it is not atypical to have a non-Hittite text embedded in a Hittite language ritual text.
Thank you. So if the Hittites kind of adopted deities from lands that they conquered and came into contact with, did they practice syncretization at all, or was it just understood that each individual deity was in fact an individual, not like your god worshipped under a different name?
Yeah, there's probably no general answer to that, but there is certainly a syncretization to the extent that the Hittites recognized types of deities. So that there was a god or a goddess associated with the sun or with the Venus star or with storm. And when they recognized such types of deities or partial overlap of types when they came into contact with other traditions. And then we can see that very easily because they use the same logograms, Sumerian logograms, to write these deities. And sometimes, and for us philologists, that's often a problem, because then the text will say in the Sumerian logogram, sun god, and we find it very hard to, sometimes we find it very hard to know which sun deity, solar deities actually behind the logogram, which had some phonetic reading that to the Hittite scribe was entirely transparent, but sometimes it's not as transparent to us. Sometimes they put a little phonogram next to it to indicate that the storm god in this case is read Teshub and not Tahunza or something like that, but it's not always clear to us. But what that shows is that they associated several different names, several deities with different names, with the same type of deity, and basically thought, well, this is the name of the god that we call Tahunza or Tahunta, and in Syria they call him Baal or Hadad or something like that, and so there we can see that there is syncretism. What we do not have to the same extent is that different rituals were consciously mixed. We have large additive rituals which have a part that looks very Hurrian, a part that looks very Hattic, but that they would actively then blend traditions into one new kind of ritual. That is, I think, more difficult to show that this happens.
Thank you so much. Those are all of the questions I had, and the audience has very much enjoyed all the information you've shared. We've had a couple of people asking a question that I don't believe can be answered yet. Okay. They're asking, how old is this language? And I'm assuming with one fragmentary text, we really can't say.
Yeah, but no, I can't say. I can say that the tablet that this text is inscribed on dates to the 13th century. That is recognizable from the form of the cuneiform signs on the tablet, and it also fits the archaeological context in which the tablet was found. So what we can say for certain is that this is an Anatolian language, so it belongs to that Anatolian branch of the Indo-European languages, and that it was still known to some extent, we do not know to which extent, in a cultic context in the 13th century. What I cannot say is whether the people of Kalasma at the time of when this tablet was inscribed, to what extent they actually spoke that language on the street, because they might have used in the cult a language that was not used on the street anymore. So there begins the uncertainty, and there I hope, but that's beyond my expertise really, that the linguists, the Indo-European linguists who are currently working on the text, that by understanding better how the language of this little text relates to the other Anatolian Indo-European languages that we know, that is to Luwian, Palaic, and Hittite mainly, and also first millennium Anatolian languages, that then maybe they can form a hypothesis how also chronologically it is, whether it has very archaic features compared to these languages or very modern features, but they haven't told me yet. And that is really, it's also a point that I made earlier, that the excavation epigraphist does his work to a certain point, and then other people have to take over. And in this case, really linguists have to take over, because I lack the training for doing that actually. But on the 2nd of February, Elisabeth Rieken and Ilya Jakubovic will give a first presentation of their linguistic analysis of the text in an online seminar at Oxford University. You can Google it, or you find it on our website also. So people who are interested in the language, I encourage to join that. It will be in English. So yeah, and the text will then also be published on that day. So, and you can see for yourself.
So everyone can take a look. Yeah. We have one final question from the audience. And if you are listening to this via podcast, please remember that you can always join us live on YouTube and submit your own questions to our interview guests. But final question, do we know where Kalashma was located?
Yeah, not exactly, but roughly. And we know that from Hittite historical texts that mention Kalashma as being in the vicinity of an area that is attested as Pala in the Hittite texts and lies situated to the northwest of the Hittite heartlands. And the area of the city of Kalasma or Kalashma must be situated in that general area as well, that is to the northwest of the Halis Bend. Where exactly, we don't know, but in one of these valleys where people settled in this area, maybe I said in the press release, possibly in the area of Bolu, but there's no site, no archaeological site that is a good candidate for it. And that is also partly due to the fact that this general area is not very well known archaeologically. Yeah, we know generally where we have to search for it, but we cannot pinpoint it really.
Dr. Schwemer, thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating interview. I've really enjoyed myself.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
It was great to be here. Thank you.
Audience, thank you all for listening, and please join us next time. Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/Digital Hammurabi to see how you can help.